Greetings, men of 222. It's great to be with you today. Today we're continuing our Common Men, Uncommon Stories series, and we're going to talk about Job and his wisdom statements. Now, we talked about Job last week, Job the father, but I want to talk a little bit about the reflections that Job had as he went through that very difficult time, of course, of testing. Remember, Job's sons and daughters were killed and his fortune was completely destroyed. Think seriously about that for a moment, if you will. The death of a son or a daughter, the loss of your fortune, and how would you feel about God? And of course, we don't know, and most of us don't know, and we don't really want to know because we don't want to go in that direction. However, Job really sets a model for us, does he not? How would you feel, if you will, about God who, according to John 10:10, came to give you life and give it abundantly, according to the Bible? I mean, that's what it says. And sometimes if we get too hung up on that God only delivers good stuff, then we can't deal very well with the bad stuff that happens. So what are the takeaways from Job? What his story, his wisdom? Well, the first conclusion that Job drew is this. He said, life is short. Well, we know that, intellectually we know that, but I don't know sometimes if we live that way. In Job 7:7, he said, remember, my life is but breath. My eye will not again see good. His life is but breath. My goodness, think about that. In and out, where'd the breath go? Well, it's not there. And that's what Job says about life. He realizes it's short. And then he confirms it in Job 30, verse 15. He said, terrors are turned against me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. My prosperity is, think about it for a second. Cloud is up there, you look at it, come back 20 minutes later, unless it's really overcast in Columbus, right? The cloud is gone. There is no trace of it. Nothing looks like it did at the time. And that's exactly what Job says about life and about prosperity and about the things that we have. So like a cloud, that's how he described it. Will that be your legacy? Will you leave behind, perhaps on a better side, great Christian sons and daughters, folks that you have taught to honor Jesus? Well, we certainly hope it's that. By the way, this sentiment about life being short appears other places in the Bible as well. In James 4:14, it says this, you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Again, great illustration, right? A vapor that's there for a moment and gone in a moment. And as human beings, we don't want to think like that. And sometimes we even think, boy, if I can just live to be 72 or 80 or even 100, that will be great. Well, you know what? In comparison to eternity and in comparison to the history of the world, that is just a very, very short time. Life is short. And Job recognized that. And then the next thing that Job does is he asks this question. He says, for what is the hope of the godless when he is cut off, when God requires his life? Job is thinking about this in terms of, well, life is short, and what is the hope of the godless? Oh man, what is the hope of society or the hope for each one of us individually? Keep in mind, it's not just having hope in anything. It needs to be hope in someone or something that can deliver. And I think what's scary is all the folks in the world who have a hope in something that cannot deliver in the final analysis. The critical thing about Jesus rising from the dead is to show that he has the power to overcome death and the grave. And no one else has done that. No one else. No one. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and 14, Paul gives us an illustration of what I would call real hope. He says, "But we don't want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep," which means dead, "so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope." I remember on 9/11, and we had a football practice that afternoon, and I'm probably the only guy in America that went ahead and had the practice. And I did it because I really felt like the kids needed to come together with the coaches and be in a safe and secure setting. And I called Pastor Ed Jackson that morning and I said, "Ed, I need a message. What message would you think I should deliver?" And he immediately said, 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and 14, because he said, "Mike, if people have died who have the hope in Christ, then they are to rise to a glorious eternity." And so what does that scripture say? He says, Paul says, "We don't want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe," and sometimes a better translation there would be, because the word "if" in Greek can also be translated "since." So you say, "For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep." We come back with Christ if we have died before the rapture occurs. Now, Jeremiah 14:22, sometimes we think, well, that's only New Testament stuff. Well, and Jeremiah 14:22 tells us this. It says, "Are there any among the idols of the nations who give rain?" Now here's the point he's trying to make. Is there anybody like God? And he goes on and says, "Can the heavens grant showers? Is it not you, O Lord our God? Therefore we hope in you, for you are the one who has done all things." Not just, as the song says, great things, but God has done all things. He sustains us. We are born because of him. We breathe because of God. Now, Job was also aware, very much so in his trials and tribulations, that purity was important. And a great verse to memorize, by the way, is Job 31:1, in which he says, "I've made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin?" Job was aware that purity was a really critical thing, and that if he lingered over his gazes and he did mental strategies to try to get somebody to go with him, he was wrong. So he said, "I've made a covenant with my eyes. How can I then gaze at a virgin?" Some people call it bouncing your eyes, and it's really critical. You can't help that some lady dresses in an inappropriate fashion. Heck, I'll tell you a story. I was driving down Henderson Road one day, and this is a true story. And a gal comes running, let's see, it would have been east on Henderson Road. I was there, and she had on nothing but her running shoes. Well, folks, if for no other reason than the strangeness of it, you have to look at that, right? But the question becomes, do you stare at it? Do you continue to look at it? And in this particular case, no, I did not. I did wrestle with whether or not she needed help, and I know that eventually some folks got her some help, some mental help, but it was a strange circumstances. So Strecker and Arterburn talk all the time about bouncing your eyes, and that's an appropriate thing to do when you're tempted. See, just because you're tempted doesn't make it sin. It's what you do beyond that makes it sin. I hope you're guarding your eyes, because pornography is not a sin without a victim. Too many guys in this country believe that pornography is a victimless crime, sin, because they look at it and they say, "Hey, the only person I'm hurting is me, if I'm hurting me." Well, no, you're hurting yourself, but if you're married, you are running the risk of destroying your wife's self-esteem and confidence. And by the way, We talk all the time now about pornography. We don't talk about adultery and sex outside of marriage. We need to do that too. Sex outside of marriage creates the same problem. There's a sin going on in your head and in your bed. You know, it invades the marriage bed, and it is something to avoid like the plague. I've told you the story of Pastor Rick Newsom, who told me when I was a relatively new Christian, he said, I pray, Lord, if I fall, kill me. That's how serious Rick was and is about the relationship he has with his wife and the relationship that he has with his God, because he knows and understands that all sin is really against God first and foremost. But the most critical takeaway for Job was this. He said, as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth. Job 19:25. So Job placed his faith in God, and he said, though he slay me, I will hope in him. That's pretty serious stuff, isn't it? Though he slay me, I will hope in him. He said, listen carefully to my speech and let my declaration fill your ears. Behold now, I have prepared my case, and I know that I will be vindicated. And yet the truth was he wasn't. But he recognized that even if he was killed, that he would still, his hope was in the Lord. In the midst of trials, and there are many in life, a smart man will ask God what he's trying to teach him in the middle of trials. So I want to tell you a little story. The only survivor of a shipwreck was washed up on a small uninhabited island, and he prayed feverishly for God to rescue him. And every day he scanned the horizon for help, but none seemed forthcoming. Exhausted, he eventually managed to build a little boat, a little hut, out of driftwood to protect him from the elements and to store his few possessions. But one day, after scavenging for food, he arrived home to find his little hut in flames, the smoke rolling up high in the sky, and the worst had happened. Everything was lost. He was stunned with grief and anger. God, how could you do this to me? Was his cry. Well, early the next day, he was awakened by the sound of a ship that was approaching the island, and it had come to rescue him. He said, how did you know I was here? Asked the weary man of his rescuers, and they said, we saw your smoke signal. Keep in mind, it is easy to be discouraged when things are going bad, but we shouldn't lose heart because God is at work in our lives, even in the midst of pain and suffering like Job. Remember, next time that your little hut is burning, it may just be a smoke signal that summons the grace of God. Job was a smart man. He understood. He restrained his mouth. He said, have I rejoiced at the extinction of my enemy, or exalted when evil befell him? And the answer was no. Many of us take great pleasure and satisfaction when our enemies fall. But Job said, no, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for his life in a curse. Job 31:29 through 30. In fact, the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends. Imagine that, who had come to be good to him, but oftentimes when people are really hurting, we open our mouths too much, just as they did. And Job prayed for his friends, and the Lord increased all that Job had twofold. You see, Job comes to the realization that he isn't as smart as God and is only fooling himself if he believes he could teach God anything. And God says as much in Job 41:11, and when he says, who has given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. Who has given to me that I should repay him? Job kept his purity. He didn't lose his faith. Even if you kill me, I will hope in you, he said. May we be so unwavering, pure, mature, and hopeful as we live our lives. Be intentional this week as you honor Jesus. See you next Saturday, Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise.